And our next speaker is our own Blue Devil, who is here at Duke. Dr. Brown. Tyson, I didn't had unfortunately much information about you, but I know that you are highly accomplished, have done some great things here at Duke. So he would be talking about advances in the conceptualization and measurement of structural racism and its effects on health. Dr. Brown.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me today. I'm excited to get a chance to learn from many of you, Dr. Yarn and the other presenters earlier today, as well as yesterday. I've been mostly viewing online, but I've been learning quite a bit, so I appreciate that. I also appreciate the opportunity to get a chance to talk with you about a topic that's near and dear to our heart, which is how do we move the needle in terms of health equity by studying the impact of structural racism on ADRD as well as other health outcomes. And I promise I will stay on time because I don't want to stand between us and the exciting roundtable we have, and of course our keynote coming up from Dr. Robinson, another Blue Devil that affected also from Carolina. So good to have Dr. Robinson here as well. So thank you very much. I will perhaps sit during part of my presentation because I'm dealing with a back issue, so please forgive me. But I'm very much engaged and excited about this topic. And obviously, it's a critical time to study these topics, given the heightened attention to structural racism and the disproportionate impact that the pandemic is having in minoritized communities. And so the aim of health equity research is to spotlight inequities that lead to unnecessary human suffering, as well as identify efficacious solutions to bring about more equitable outcomes. Real quickly, just want to acknowledge some of the generous support that has funded my research. And I'll move along. And in the interest of parsimony, I'm going to skip over a few things to keep it really nice and focused so we have enough time for Q&A. So I'd like to really begin by zooming out to give an overview of the trends in research on race and health, with special attention to where we've been, where we are, and where I think we should go as a field. And obviously, we've gained a lot of very important foundational information about racial and ethnic inequity in health from descriptive studies, right? There's a real value in descriptive studies. And so I think going forward, we should maintain that. We can learn a lot. Fortunately, the field has largely moved beyond discredited biological and cultural deficit explanations for the disparities that we see. We've also seen the limited utility of behavioral and human capital explanations for racial inequities, oftentimes residual racial disparities after accounting for things like human behavior and socioeconomic status are attributed to discrimination. But these approaches operate under an untenable assumption, which is that racism doesn't shape the behaviors and the acquisition of socioeconomic resources in the first place, right? So it's becoming clear that focusing solely on individual behavioral factors leads to an incomplete and biased understanding of the real drivers of racial inequities in health, including ADRD. And so scholars are really increasingly conceptualizing racial inequities as a consequence of structural racism. However, relatively few studies have empirically tested this proposition. And so skeptics point to the, somewhat of a relative dearth of quantitative research on the topic, and they dismiss structural racism as a slippery concept for which we lack, for which robust empirical evidence documenting its effects is still lacking. So as a field, I would argue that, and many others are making the same argument, that we've really got a great opportunity to gain empirical traction by actually measuring structural racism and its effects on health, including ADRD. And so this will enable us to do a number of things that have been quite rare in the literature. This includes things like answering new, innovative questions, right? It shifts our focus. It also allows us to employ more rigorous research designs that actually account for the variation in health outcomes better than simply focusing on individual level factors. And also allows us to build a knowledge base to inform efficacious racial equity solutions. So despite the centrality of structural explanations for understanding racialized inequality, less than 1% of the studies on the links between race and health have actually operationalized structural racism in these studies, right? So it's exceedingly rare. The actual percentage was 0.04%. So very, very rare. And rarer still are studies that examine how structural racism affects the lives of older adults. And so we know that investigating disparities and equities in late life present a number of challenges. I don't have to tell you, right? I'm speaking, preaching to the choir here. But we also know that it also provides unique opportunities for understanding the cumulative impact of social inequalities across the life course. And so racial inequities in late life are rooted in more than a half century of differential exposure to various forms of racism. So the NIH Health Disparities Framework is especially useful for conceptualizing and measuring how structural racism really gets under the skin of the environmental, social, cultural, and biological pathways. And one of the things I most appreciate about this framework is that it shifts our focus to how upstream social determinants of ADRD are linked to downstream factors, right? And so it really provides a more comprehensive understanding and moves away from solely focusing on proximate determinants. So my colleague Patricia Homan and I have a recent study at the Journal Health Affairs that examines how structural racism in the form of unequal felon disenfranchisement affects health. So just as a background, felon disenfranchisement is racialized because it disproportionately stifles Black political power. And so Black Americans are 370% more likely than their non-Black counterparts to be disenfranchised. Though I will note that there's considerable variation across states. And this is a state-based analysis. So based on data from the Sentencing Project, as well as the Health and Retirement Study, our study shows that living in states with higher levels of racialized disenfranchisement is associated with more depressive symptoms, more functional limitations, more IADLs, and more ADLs among older Black adults. However, there is no statistically significant association between structural racism and these health outcomes among whites.
You define disenfranchisement.
So yes, exactly. Thank you. So yeah, I'm often speaking to social scientists, so I'm good. Yeah, so disenfranchisement refers to the inability, the restriction of voting rights based on, this is felon disenfranchisement, due to having a felony conviction.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And it's racialized to the extent it's operationalized by capturing disproportionate felony disenfranchisement rates among Black adults. Yeah. So these findings really suggest that policies aiming to mitigate disproportionate Black felon disenfranchisement not only are essential for Black political exclusion or Black political inclusion rather, but may also be valuable tools for improving population health equity. And it's becoming more and more clear that the inequitable distribution of population health is really a mirror reflecting societal arrangements. And so along these lines, I'd like to share an overview of a broad research agenda on the links between structural racism and health that I think can move the field forward. And there's this burgeoning body of research that suggests that structural racism is in fact a topic for health among older adults. And yet our understanding of these phenomena has been hindered by both conceptual as well as methodological gaps in the literature. And so our research really must aim to address these gaps by conceptualizing, quantifying, and mapping structural racism, as well as estimating its impact on health, including ADRD outcomes. So to better understand the role of structural racism in shaping ADRD, I'll outline several research priorities to move the field forward. The first is that we should really be utilizing core tenets of structural theories to guide measurement approaches, right? Pretty straightforward. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. A lot of literature going back 100 years to do this, right? And second, we need to develop novel theory-informed multi-sectoral measures of structural racism, right? I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. And third, by mapping structural racism, we'll gain a better understanding of the geographic variation and racial exclusion as well as subordination. And fourth, we should really be estimating directly the impact of structural racism on ADRD disparities by linking contextual structural racism measures with geocoded data on ADRD as well as demographics. And this is, this is not, this is before there were a number of barriers to doing this, but it's getting a little bit better. And to move that along, fifth, I argue that we really need to lower the barriers to this type of research by building a publicly available data infrastructure on measures of structural racism that are linked to NIH-funded data sets in order to catalyze research on the structural determinants of health. This will really lower the barriers and move things forward at a much, at a much quicker clip, hopefully. So, what is structural racism, right? So, scholars have long lamented that there are many challenges in measuring structural racism, and I can attest to that, because it's a complex and insidious de facto phenomenon that's often, it's hidden, right, and not directly observed, often. And so it's not surprising that there are relatively few empirical studies that explicitly measure it and then link it to health outcomes like ADRD. And so several theoretical frameworks over the years have offered foundational grounding of the ways in which dimensions of structural racism intersect and work together as a system. And here I've just provided a few sort of descriptions from that literature, but in the interest of time, I'll move on. So my colleague and I, we are working on a study that scopes the broader literature on to really identify the central tenets of structural racism theories in an effort to understand the complexities of structural racism impact on health. And so we built upon prior theoretical innovations by really distilling foundational ideas of structural racism in the literature to generate a definition that provides, I think, conceptual and analytical clarity on its nature and its impact. And so we posit that structural racism involves a multifaceted, interconnected, and institutionalized system of relational subordination for people of color and superordination for whites that's observable in inequities in life outcomes. And so, in short, structural racism refers to systemic exclusion from power, from resources, from opportunities, and also from well-being. And so it's embedded in major political, economic, social, medical, and criminal legal institutions. And we see it observable in things like racial inequities in education and occupation, wages, wealth, housing, political representation, incarceration, and the list goes on, right? And so structural racism is considered a fundamental cause that's driving racial inequities in health because it shapes the whole constellation of more immediate health risks and as well as health promoting resources that individuals are exposed to. And so structural racism can affect health ultimately through many different intervening mechanisms and as well as pathways. So most research on links between structural racism and health have focused on structural racism at the neighborhood level or the county level, which are really key contexts because really important because they're much more local. But they often ignore macro level state environments, and this is unfortunate because U.S. states are obviously more, very important legal, administrative, and political units, and we're seeing this more and more. States have always provided an important context for racial stratification, including most obviously the role that they played with respect to slavery, Jim Crow, and miscegenation laws. And states, as we see, are continuing to play a major role and have a great deal of autonomy and great deal of heterogeneity with respect to their policies and practices. Things like disenfranchisement laws, aggressive policing, punitive sentencing, as well as the expansion and contraction of the of safety net resources, right? And these are oftentimes very much linked to racialized dynamics within those states. And so as a result, my colleague and I were working on a study that proposes conceptualizing states as racializing institutional actors that influence population health. So after immersing myself in this literature for the last 5 years or so, I was surprised to find that there are these huge gaps. And so there's a lot of questions that remain as to how to best measure structural racism, as well as its impact on things like ADRD. And so I'm currently working on a project that aims to address a couple of questions. And the first is, does state level structural racism across societal domains, does it reflect an underlying latent construct, right? And so latent constructs are phenomena that are not directly observed. And then secondly, how does state level structural racism affect the health of Black and white older adults? All right, right. So to examine variability in U.S. State level structural racism and its relationship to health among Blacks and whites, we can find indicators of structural racism from several sources of publicly available data. And then we link these to geocoded data demographics and health outcomes in the HRS as well as in the BRSS, right, which is the largest U.S. health population health study in the U.S. And then the analytic sample that I'm going to present today is comprised of U.S. born Blacks and whites. So this table here, it shows each of the domains as well as the individual indicators of structural racism that I examined. And so this is publicly available data you'll see this is for the year 2010, and it spans 5 sectors or 5 societal domains, including the judicial system, educational, economic system, political participation, as well as residential segregation. And the measurement approach here is informed by theoretical perspectives as well as previously validated measures of state level structural racism. You see some of the citations at the bottom in case you're interested in doing this type of research. So increasingly over the last 10 or 8 to 10 years, indicators such as these have been used to try to attempt to quantify structural racism, right? But most of them have looked at them individually. So the next step is to test whether state level structural racism reflects an underlying latent construct. So I'm especially interested in measuring structural racism in ways that align with structural theories. And so a latent variable approach, for example, is well suited for minimizing measurement error and also capturing conceptual properties of a complex system that's difficult to measure or quantify directly. Such as structural racism. So in many ways, I would argue this is kind of a marriage made in heaven between the method and the concept. And so along those lines, the 9 indicators of structural racism that I showed you on the previous slide, they were used to develop a latent measure of structural racism. And we use confirmatory factor analysis to measure the extent to which structural racism across the domains are reflective of an underlying latent construct, and systematically evaluated model fit using various model specifications related to correlated errors as well as the dimensionality. And all considered, the model that we identified, the CFA model that specifies a single dimension of structural racism and allows for common sources of variation in the indicators that are largely independent or largely conceptually motivated, has a good fit with the data and generates reasonable parameter estimates. I'll show a little bit more on that in the next slide. So building on the previous slide, this figure illustrates the factor structure of the latent construct of structural racism. And so these correlated errors are all intended to address common sources of variation that are independent of the effects of structural racism on the various indicators, right? And so taken together, the statistics here, the fit statistics here indicate that indicators do in fact reflect an underlying latent construct and it fits the data rather well. Each of these indicators is in the very good to excellent range. We can always chat about this at the end. But now I'd like to turn to addressing the second research question, which is how does structural racism shape health among older adults? In order to understand this contextually, it's really important to come back to theory just for a moment. So eco-social theories become the leading framework for understanding how macro level discriminatory environments ultimately shape health. And the theory suggests that macro level structural racism has deleterious effects on Black people's health, and more specifically, it points out how structural racism results in the inequitable distribution of life outcomes and ultimately harms the health of Black people via an array of pathways of embodiment, such as economic injustice, such as social deprivation, toxic living conditions, political exclusion, and inadequate health care, as well as psychosocial factors, many things that we've discussed today, yesterday, as well as read in the literature. But discriminatory social environments have the potential to affect everyone. So by measuring structural racism, we can actually look at its effects on whites as well. And as the oppressed group, we might logically expect structural racism to be linked to poor health among Black people because there's negative impact on their resources and status and exposure. And that's pretty straightforward. But we don't really know much about how it affects whites, right? And so there are a couple competing perspectives here. First, you have the traditional conflict perspective that sees oppressive social relations as a zero-sum game, sort of benefiting the dominant group at the expense of the subordinate group. And so in this scenario, whites would benefit from structural racism. because it provides them with greater relative status, power, resources, and so on. And so if this is the case, we would expect to see a negative relationship between health problems and racism among white people. Now, on the other hand, there's a great deal of research and theory suggesting that social inequality is bad for everyone. So a universal harm hypothesis would predict that social racism also undermines the health of whites. And this is in line with structural pluralist theories that positing that structural inequalities damage social relationships and make society as a whole less productive, less cooperative, less safe, and less healthy, thereby harming both marginalized as well as dominant groups. Still, we might expect whites to reap some benefits, and so the lines are not drawn parallel because there might be differences in the magnitude of the harmful effects. And of course, it's also possible that whites' health is unaffected by structural racism, or it appears unaffected by structural racism because there might be countervailing forces, right? And we can chat about that a little bit more during the Q&A. But suffice to say, the jury's out, evidence is mixed, very thin so far, and so that's why I wanted to jump in and address this. So in the studies today, I'm going to show you, we use 5 common measures of population health. These include self-rated health, functional limitations, body mass index, depressive symptoms, as well as a number of core mental health days. And we, in order to sort of isolate the effects of structural racism on health outcomes, we control for things like, age, gender, region, the percent of the population that's Black, state level unemployment, as well as state level income inequality. And we looked at a number of other factors as well, but we wanted to keep a somewhat parsimonious model, but results were robust, including a range of other contextual factors. All right, so we use multivariate regression analysis to estimate the relationship between structural racism and health. We use multi-level models, and we stratify, which is consistent with prior theory. And we use the multi-level models to account for the non-independence of and respondents method within states. All right, let's jump into the results. So this graph shows the relationship between structural racism and self-rated health by race, and this is from the Health and Retirement Study. And we see that higher levels of structural racism are associated with worse self-rated health among Black people in the Health and Retirement Study. And to provide a little bit of context on the magnitude of this association, a 1 standard deviation increase in structural racism has an effect on self-rated health that's equivalent to a 2 standard deviation change in age, right? And so we know that age matters among older, middle-aged and older adults. And what this is suggesting is that for self-rated health, structural racism has twice the impact on health. However, there's no statistically significant relationship between structural racism and white self-rated health. Similarly, structural racism is associated with more functional limitations among Black adults, but not whites. We see the same pattern for BMI, where structural racism is predictive of higher BMI for Black people, while it's unrelated to the BMI among whites. And structural racism is also associated with more depressive symptoms for Black people, but not whites. And if you think you're starting to see a pattern, it's because you are. We look across all these outcomes, remarkably similar, like freakishly similar. I mean, I was jumping up and down, but I was excited when I saw this. I mean, not because I'm excited that people are being harmed, but because I felt like we found a signal, right? And so, the idea is you can't improve something unless you actually measure it. And so, in that regard, it was nice to be able to find this signal, right? But still, as a hallmark of science, replication matters. And so we wanted to, go out and see if we saw this in other data sets. And so that's what we did. And so we looked at this in 2 health outcomes and the BRFSS. And as you can see, once again, we find that structural racism is harmful for the health of Black people. This was true for both self-rated health as well as poor mental health days. But that's not the case for whites. So in one instance, and for self-rated health, structural racism is unrelated to the health of whites. And for poor mental health days, we see that whites actually do benefit. It appears that there is a benefit to structural racism for their number of poor mental health days, right? And so this would lead to support for the conflict perspective. So of course, we can't talk about structural racism without talking about the pandemic. And more than 1 million Americans have died in the last 3 years due to the pandemic. And we know the impact has been unequal across the color line. and Black people are experiencing much higher rates of mortality than their white counterparts. And while numerous commentaries and conceptual articles have theorized about the impact of structural racism on the disparities in COVID deaths, very few studies have actually empirically tested the proposition. And so, in a recent study, my colleagues and I, we test this relationship between structural racism and Black-white inequities in COVID deaths at the state level. And results reveal substantial variation in Black-white ratios of age-adjusted COVID mortality, as well as variation in structural racism. And regression estimates indicate that the relationship between structural racism and Black-white inequities in COVID mortality is in fact positive and statistically significant, both in the bivariate model as well as the net of a range of covariates, some of what I talked about before. So, for example, whereas states with structural racism value 2 standard deviations below the mean, they have a Black-white ratio of approximately 1.2 or 1.1 rather. States with a structural racism value 2 standard deviations above the mean have a ratio of just over 2.1, right? So it's a big swing. It's rather steep. It's very significant. It explains 54% of the variation, and this was net, robust to a net number of good founders. I'll also mention that this latent variable approach was shown to be superior to looking at individual indicators as well as summative index. It accounted for 24% more variation than a summative index. I can talk more about that during Q&A if you'd like. But notably, several recent studies highlight geographic variability in the prevalence of dementia among HRS respondents. And so future research really should examine how spatial variation and structural race is linked to variation in ADRD disparities. This is, I think, a really key area that needs to be studied, and I know a number of folks are moving in that direction. In the interest of time, I'm going to kind of move us along. It's also important to think about, legal and policy contexts. Happy to chat about that during the Q&A. It's also important to take into account measures of cultural and ideological anti-Blackness. You can see a number of potential data sources and concepts that I think would be useful to be linked to ADRD research. Thinking about the role of racial animus and hate speech and racial attitudes, implicit and implicit biases, to really identify hotspots, if you will, of cultural racism and see how that undermines the health of Black Americans. You can also think about the role of history, right? History is not even, history is not even history, right? It's not even gone, right? We're still seeing the ramifications of a number of racialized policies and practices that were 150 years ago. So I want to try to get through this. I want to talk about future directions. I got 2 minutes. All right. So I'd like to just highlight what I think are some exciting opportunities for future research to enhance our understanding on the links between structural racism and ADRD, which can use to really inform efficacious solutions. So, for example, future studies, I'd argue, should use longitudinal data, which I don't think I'm going to push back on, to understand the temporal dimensions of this relationship, such as the potential for sensitive periods, for durations of exposure, as well as likely lagged effects. Multi-level research is also sorely needed in order to understand cross-level structural racism linkages and their joint effects on ADRD. And also, as the data ecosystem is rapidly changing, scholars are increasingly calling for wider use of big data sources in research. And so we echo in our studies and expand upon these calls by recommending the use of these new approaches to address salient new questions about how structural racism shapes population health. And so, harnessing the digital trace data, I think, is especially useful as the traditional data sources become increasingly costly, logistically complex, and become less representative of the target population due to declining response rates and other selective forces. Moving forward, we recommend testing the extent to which structural racism affects health indirectly through intermediary social pathways, such as unequal access to resources and exposures to risks. And finally, examining the biosocial processes is also a promising direction for future research on how structural oppression is connected to ADRD. And I think I don't have time to discuss this, so I'll just flash my slide up and we can chat about it in the Q&A.
Thank you, and thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, so we have one question on the chat.
Let me quickly address this. So the question is by Tonkan Chandarat, is it more accurate to say living in a racist society rather than exposure to structural racism?
Can you break this?
Yeah, sure.
Yes. Yes, that's a very astute question by Tonkan Chantarat. He does great work in this space on measuring structural racism. I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to talk more about it. Yes.
So this question right there.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to your statement that you can't improve something unless you measure it, which is also in our last presentation with the fish and the one fish that was the smallest one. What about the temporal dimension? Can you speak more to that? But what I'm referring to that is at least in two sort of implications. One is the idea of generational trauma, right? And that sort of traumatic reactions can be passed along in families. And then secondly, if we create interventions that improve things, sort of how would you measure that? For example, say in Georgia, which had hundreds of years of history of slavery and voter suppression and miscegenation laws. But in the last election, they voted for Biden, they elected a Black senator, a Jewish senator, right? So things seem to be changing in Georgia. Does that mean that if someone, say, grew up in Savannah, which used to be a slave trading center, and then say moved to San Francisco, which is presumably. Okay, sorry. The point being that how would you measure sort of the temporal aspect of what you're describing?
Yeah, well, thank you. That's a great question. Yeah, so first of all, I'll say that my statement about, really need to measure something in order to improve it. I'm not the first to say that, right? Because folks have mentioned that throughout this. And also one of my collaborators, Rachel Hardiman, has also been very vocal about this need. And so I want to acknowledge others out there who are doing this work, also talking about this topic. You raised a really important issue, right? This is the challenge of doing research that really looks upstream and looks at these contextual factors and how they drive these health inequities. But the short answer is we need longitudinal data. And, I very much do take a life course perspective when I'm thinking about these things. And so if we think about this, not only over the span of an individual's life, but looking at this across generations and generational trauma, it's difficult to unpack. That's certainly quite the challenge to actually measure and to identify variation. I'm an optimist, so I think that much of this work can be done. It's a challenge for sure, but I think that's what a number of teams across the country are working on, right? Trying to address these sorts of issues and thinking about we can think about this really as a specific case of racialized cumulative disadvantage as a result of living in a racist society, right? And so this accumulation of inequities across generations that are ultimately passed on. So there's a scholar, Bridget Gooseby, has an excellent article on transgenerational influences of racism on health outcomes and how these compound over time. Dr. Robinson has very much been thinking about these sorts of issues. So maybe we'll be hearing about that during the keynote address. But yeah, I think that's a really important topic. We need longitudinal data. 50 years from now, I hope that I'm kind of joking. I hope we have it much sooner, but really, it takes time to look at this over time, right? And we're just now, getting serious about measuring structural racism across these fields. And so my hope is that in the years to come, that we do have a solid scientific evidence base to have some clear answers to questions like you just raised.